Welcome to Second Sunday Forum. Program started in 2021 by the Peace and Social Order Committee, of which I'm in charge for West Falmouth, a preparative meeting on Cape Cod. Today we welcome Devon Kurtz. He'll be talking about the faces of mass incarceration, a Quaker approach. But first, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Wampanoag land. And in fact, I live in a Wampanoag city in Mashpee. So this will be filmed and edited, and with the approval of Devon, posted on our YouTube site. And today is November 10th, 2024, a Sunday. And let's see. So Devon attends Quaker meetings in Hanover, Vermont, Salt Lake City, and Jesus Lane Friends meeting in Cambridge, UK. He's a 2023 Legacy grantee and a prison reform advocate and a facilitator of Quaker worship and chaplaincy for men behind bars. He's worked with the state legislator across America to reform the criminal justice systems in his role as a policy director at the Cicero Institute, a public policy think tank, and as a public affairs advisor to Social Purpose Corrections, a nonprofit that's disrupting the private prison industry. Outside of his professional roles, he's committed to restorative justice as a volunteer. He's currently getting a master's in the UK in penology, and his book, Sketches from Behind Bars, is the subject of his talk and what he got the Legacy grant for in part. And he'll be talking about that today. It's available on Amazon. I give you Devon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica. And for those who don't want to buy from Amazon, as many Quakers don't, I personally don't mind, but it's also for sale at Harvard Bookstore and a couple other independent bookstores. So I'll always like to include that. Well, thank you so much for having me, and I'll try to keep this to probably about half an hour, and then we can spend another half an hour with Q&A that can span the book as well as my other work in the criminal justice system. So this has been kind of the focus of my work my entire professional life. It started when I was in college out of an interest in prison chaplaincy, and I actually ended up dropping out of college and moving to California to help build the Cicero Institute, which was 2018, 2019. And since then, I've advised about 25 state legislatures on criminal justice reform, ranging from policing to private prisons to probation and parole. So I can speak to a lot of the trends and how things have changed over the last 5 or 6 years. There's been a pretty big shift in the conversation, and I've definitely been immersed in that. But this book really comes more recently. When I moved back to Vermont from California, I ended up attending Hanover Friends meeting, and it was a few years later that we had a presentation from the American Friends Service Committee on mass incarceration and some of the anti-death penalty work they were doing in New Hampshire. From there, we ended up having a conversation about how Hanover Friends meeting had led Quaker worship at a women's prison in Windsor, Vermont, about a decade earlier. The prison ended up closing, so they stopped the worship group, and they didn't continue it at any of the other facilities in New Hampshire or Vermont. So I expressed interest in trying to rebuild that ministry, and got a lot of support from the meeting to do so. I was primarily doing it alone, but within the meeting there were people who would come occasionally, but for the most part, it was having a group of people to support me in work that was fairly intimidating. At that point, I was no stranger to the criminal justice system. I'd done restorative justice work in a lot of the same people that I ended up working with inside the facility. But it's a different thing to show up at, I think I was like 25 at the time, into a prison that's mostly elderly. I shouldn't say mostly, but it is probably 30 to 40% elderly. which is very unique. Vermont has a very old prison system compared to most other states. So it was, yeah, totally new environment. And I was really grateful that early on in establishing the Quaker worship group, I met Rein Colts, who was himself a Quaker, or a longstanding Quaker. He was a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War. He was an immigrant from Austria, and he was, incarcerated. He was elderly. Was going to spend pretty much the rest of his life in prison, and he really helped me build the worship group. And there were times where he could, as a peer, better explain certain concepts to the other men than I could as both very young and an outsider. So we really worked together on it, and over a few years we were able to build a small but dedicated group of about 5 or 6 people, and then over periods of time we would get a couple other people to trickle in. At that time when we started, that was February 2022, I think, and the facility had just reopened to volunteers. And actually, I think it may have even been 2023. I forget the exact date, but they had closed the facility down to all volunteer programming during the pandemic for several years. And as a result, most of the volunteers who had been coming, it's a pretty isolated prison. It's a Southern State Correctional Facility in Springfield, Vermont. And most of the volunteer programming disappeared. So when they reopened it in December, I was the second or third uh, volunteer to come into the facility. They had a Roman Catholic service, an evangelical Protestant service, and then our Quaker worship group. And I ended up spending a lot of time with non-Christians who were looking for a space where they could worship and not have a creed. So we would get Muslims, we would get Satanists, pretty much anyone under the sun would come in, and they usually wouldn't stay, but they would still be able to share in the worship. I eventually helped the facility get the Muslim chaplain at Dartmouth to do a monthly service there. And I think Dartmouth also facilitates a Native American worship. So by the time I left the facility, they had robust volunteer programming, but it really was a period of having to rebuild it after several years of them not having any access to that kind of programming. So Rein and I became quite close, and he ended up sharing with me a few months into our partnership on this, all of this artwork that he had created over several years since I think he got to prison in 2015. And he was always an artist, but while he was in prison, he was limited to the kinds of materials and mediums he could use for his art. So his main form was sketches, and he ended up sketching the other men that he was incarcerated with. And he had asked over the years for them to write something to accompany the artwork. So he had probably maybe 30 or 40 of these sketches and testimonials. And he just mailed them to me. I mean, it was, he kind of mentioned, oh, I have something I want to share with you. And he wrote a note saying, my wife has been collecting these over the years, and we hope to share these with the world because we do believe that they're powerful, but we just don't have the ability to do anything about it. He's in prison and she's distraught, understandably. So they asked me to sort of take up the mantle, and if I was interested, and try to publish them. So I had intended to do so, and began the long process of curating and editing. And he kept it sort of gave him a new energy to create more. So he probably created another dozen or more over the 6 months or so that I had started working on it. And around that time, I had looked into different avenues for publication, and ended up learning of the witness and ministry legacy grants, and ended up applying for one. for a multi-part project, of which the book was really only one part, but it was the main, probably the biggest and most ambitious part. But we wanted to really focus in on the artistic needs of the facility, and bringing in arts and culture, but then also highlighting what is being produced there. So the first part of the grant was to have a gallery show for Rein's artwork, and we did that in May of this past year at a gallery in Springfield, Vermont, at an old bank vault. It's a really, really wonderful gallery. And we were able to bring in some folks from the facility, from the staff of the facility, from the Vermont Department of Corrections, and from the district attorney's office. The district attorney himself came. He had prosecuted some of the people you know, were in the art, which was sort of an interesting dynamic. But we had a really, really amazing group, and it was fascinating to see sort of the conversations between some of the correctional staff. Obviously, the Hanover Friends meeting was a big part of who came. So we had one of the friends, June, who is a prison abolitionist, and is she ran for governor, and this past round is the Workers' Party or something. So she's decked out in like you know communist paraphernalia and stuff, shirts and stuff, and she's talking to the district attorney in front of the artwork. And I remember hearing her say, she's like, "It's such a shame that they're incarcerated." And he turns to her, and he's kind of like, "Well, read the case file, maybe." So it was the kinds of conversations we had hoped to create, and it was sort of putting a lot of different people with different perspectives on the criminal justice system in one place, and being able to discuss it over really beautiful artwork. That was an amazing event. And right after that, we published the book. So we were able to get substantial funding to curate and publish the book. And I can talk a bit more about its contents. But the final two parts of it are still ongoing. One, I guess the third part occurred in July. I had worked with a folk musician in Vermont who had been following my work, and had been really interested in doing musical events that would raise awareness of social issues. So his band's called the Nonprofits, but instead of Profit, it's Prophet. And he was really interested. We had talked for a number of years about trying to get him to come into the facility. And we ended up deciding to plan a memorial concert as part of this, because the backdrop of this book is that the Southern State Correctional Facility has one of the highest mortality rates of prisons in the United States. They've lost like 5% of the facility in the last couple of years. And it's a lot of elderly men, as I said. So a lot of it is natural causes, but there are also suicides. Not so much violence, but mostly suicides and illness. And Mark Sedan, one of the men in the Quaker worship group, he passed away this past January. So it was around that same time that we really decided we wanted to do a memorial concert as part of this. So we did that back in July, and we were able to get approval from the Vermont Department of Corrections to record it. So we'll have a edited but live recording of the concert from inside the prison, and we'll be distributing that on Spotify, as well as making an actual old school vinyl album with Rein's artwork on the cover. So it's been a really meandering project. And we're hoping to have those by the end of the year. We'll see. We're now coming up on the end of the year, so I'm not too optimistic that we'll get there, but we really wanted something that would give people something tangible to hold on to, that they could pick up whenever they want, whether it's the book or the vinyl, and just remind them that there are people behind bars. It's not something that most of us like to think about. The closer you get to it, sometimes the more you have to think about it less. And we really wanted something that was positive. The book is definitely dark. There's a lot of material in there that is is pretty challenging, but it's also all centered around really beautiful art, really beautiful writing. And I think that's really rare. So much of what when we discuss mass incarceration, it's sort of unrelenting darkness. And I read about this in the introduction. We have an obsession with the numbers. The scale is so big compared to all of our peer nations that we really just get drowned out in the sheer scale, per capita rates, all those different things. And I wanted to take the opposite approach of let's start with the individual. Let's look at their faces. Let's hear what they have to say, and then build up from there, rather than trying to focus in on the data. Which, as a policy person, it's sort of funny because my professional career is the exact opposite. But for this, I thought we could do something really, really powerful the other direction. So yeah, we came up with the book in May, and we were able to get some of the copies into the prison. And I do want to talk about the book specifically in a second, but the most recent development is that the Vermont Department of Corrections responded really, really poorly to the book. At first, they came to the gallery show. Everyone in the prison was very supportive. Once the headquarters started to see the articles being written about it, and there is content in the book that is critical of the prison system, they ended up firing me as a volunteer, and I'm no longer allowed back in the facility as a result of the book. As I've heard, the copies of the book are still in the facility. There's still some in the library, so they haven't banned the book within the facility, but they're sending a clear message to the handful of other volunteers in the facility, many of which I helped recruit, that this is not the sort of thing that they want to come out of their volunteer programs. And this is one of the most progressive departments of corrections in the country. This is not Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola. Like this is Vermont, and they're still very, very unwilling to be challenged, to elevate voices of the people who are behind bars. And it was actually every Department of Corrections has a victims' rights office, and their job was primarily to inform victims of crime about parole dates for the individuals who victimized them. They've sort of taken a more expansive role, and I had a couple of encounters with various state departments of corrections, victim services offices, and they tend now to take an active role in suppressing access to the institution. When I was a journalist, I was denied access to two men who had killed two Dartmouth professors in the early 2000s, around the time that they were the 20th anniversary of their crime was coming up, and I was denied access by the Victim Services Office. So I've seen this before. This was the most extreme example of them trying to basically censor a book, but it's an issue that I think is underappreciated on the policy side. And again, we can talk about that during Q&A of some of my experiences there, but no one's really talking about how the victim services offices are taking a pretty staunch and in my view, repressive stance against freedom of expression in their facilities. And it really worries me that books like this, at least at that facility and probably throughout the Vermont Department of Corrections, won't happen again until there's maybe some leadership change or it kind of falls from memory. But I was fortunate to be able to coordinate with Hanover Friends Meeting to get a replacement to run the meeting at the prison, and I ended up leaving the state anyways. But I'm working with Cornell Law School currently to actually file a lawsuit against the Vermont Department of Corrections to try to reverse this. But that's sort of the latest context of how this has gone out, and I'm sure they'll have a similar reaction when the vinyl album comes out. But to get into the book itself, for another, it looks like we have maybe 10 more minutes to talk before I want to switch over to Q&A. But I wanted to share, I'll do a couple of readings of my favorite parts of the book and talk a bit about them. So I'm going to share my screen. So I will keep it on this image. This is my it's the first piece in the book. Um, and it's one of the he was one of the last people to contribute to the book. He didn't include his name, and instead he wrote something that again I think is the most powerful piece in the book. Its title is "Who Cares?" I hesitated to contribute. I think you can see why. Yeah, I know, I'm ugly. But it wasn't always that way. When I came in some 20 years ago, I cared. But as years went by and the parole board kept denying my release, I knew I would never get out. Food became my friend. My family had enough money for my commissary. I just don't care. There's just this lie about rehabilitation and getting out, but no one cares. So I just eat and secretly laugh about how hard it will be to remove my body when I finally die. How perverse is that? You don't need to know my name. Hardly anyone does. But remember my face. It will be in the obituary soon, and you will say, poor fat guy. A beautiful writer. Not all of the writing in this was as easy. I don't think I made any changes to that. I mean, it is just really excellent poetry. But it also it takes you through the frustration of the release process of rehabilitation, the parole and rehabilitation, especially in policy circles, is sort of presented as the good part of the criminal justice system. It's there. The prison is so dark and evil, and the process of getting in, the sentencing, the courts, all of that is so um, difficult. But then there's this way out, and that way out is presumably through rehabilitation. And I mean, he just indicts it pretty bluntly. And then talking about sort of a form of addiction in the form of food. So much of what is discussed in terms of physical and mental health within facilities is often focused on substance abuse and sort of inadequate access to healthcare. You don't really hear as much of a conversation about binge eating from commissary. So it's a really unique take that certainly was the first I had heard of something like that. But my favorite part about all of it is that he's very irreverent to the book itself. I mean, I take this as sort of a he still contributed to the project, so it still is he's still buying into it to some degree, but he's very suspicious of its intentions, and rightfully so. I mean, the audience for this book are really the rest of us. I did want to get it into facilities, but he understands that most of the people reading this are going to be people who never have any experience with the criminal justice system, or at least are fairly distant from it. And he takes issue with that. And I wanted to set the tone for the book by or with a piece that really questioned why we were writing it in the first place, and if that was a justifiable project or endeavor. And by the end, I think that we capture a really interesting and diverse cross section of one small prison in the United States, in a rural part of the United States. But it was, I think, the right note to start on. I'll share maybe one or two more that I find really powerful. And frankly, the book is divided into four sections: indignity, loss, silence, and faith. And the structure of the book really came about when Rein sent me the collection, the final collection that included this one. Um, you can see that the style sort of shift. This one is a lot more shadowing in some of the later ones, and the content was a lot harder. A lot of it dealt with death. A lot of it dealt with faith and God and really existential questions. And that's sort of how the final section of the book came about, was maybe 80 to 90% of that final contribution of portraits went into that last section. And then I built the rest of the book around it. And so the first section all focuses, starting with this one, on really what sociologists call the pains of imprisonment, the sort of inherent indignities of being stripped of your liberty and forced into a prison or jail. And I'll read a couple more from that section. Loss then focuses on really that separation from family, from the outside, from the milestones of life. It's your clock stops, but the clock for the rest of the world continues. The second section really focuses in on that. The third section, silence, is in part a reference to sort of the origin of the book through Quaker worship, but it's also the set of portraits that didn't have writing accompanying them. So not every man who was drawn by Rein decided to contribute writing. I didn't want to cut them from the book, so they either ended up on the cover. Some of the very final ones that I had received were the cover, and then the other ones ended up in the section on silence, which is just a collection of portraits. And at the beginning of each section, you know, I write a brief introduction, sort of walking through the thematic curation, and then trying to give some aesthetic commentaries on the actual portraits themselves and some of the poetry. But I want to read this one. This is also in that section on indignity. Just Pete. I was dragged today. They tell me I need to be in protective custody. For what reasons, I'm not sure. That part doesn't matter. The facility determines the appropriate remedy, not me. To the whole. I expect to be there for at least a few days. I grieve. Things happen so quickly here, unintentionally. There are no exceptions. Hope for the best. A lot of the writing is very laconic. It's very sharp, very concise, and part of that is frankly that you know, literacy rates in prisons are quite low. This is an amazing collection of writing, despite that fact. But it leads me to wonder some of the men that didn't contribute writing, whether or not they actually could. In one of the final weeks before I was fired from the prison, I had gone to the first graduation ceremony that they had since before the pandemic, a high school graduation ceremony, and there were three men, one of which was in our Quaker worship group, is why I attended. But one of the men who ended up giving sort of their, you know, valediction, he was probably in his 60s and had pretty much been incarcerated his entire life, in and out. He was from the Northeast Kingdom in Vermont, which is the most rural and underdeveloped part of Vermont. It's mostly just a collection of dirt roads. And he was a farmhand. And it wasn't until he was in his 50s, late 50s, in prison, that he learned how to read. And the reason he learned how to read and write and started his high school education was because he was getting infections in his legs and he wasn't able to fill out the medical slips to ask for medical care. So he ended up losing both of his legs. And it was only after he had lost both of his legs that he decided that he needed to learn how to read in order to continue living. And he, you know, over a decade later, did finally graduate. And it was one of the most just moving things I had ever seen in the facility. But it also reminded me that, you know, this book is only possible because it only captures the portion of the population that is able to. There is a swath of individuals who would opt out of contributing to a project like this for various reasons, but also those who simply can't. And I was in a position where I had to sort of just take whatever Rein gave me as far as the artwork and writing. I think that there were ways we could have broadened access to the project if we had done some some dictation or something like that. But there is definitely an intimidation for a lot of the men in fairly basic things like reading and writing. So overall, when I was going through the editing process, I was really impressed with the writing. But I do want to acknowledge that there were limitations to that because of simply just the lack of access to education. I'll turn to some of the later sections of the book to do maybe one more reading before we can turn over to some Q&A. This is the one I had the hardest part with, Vladimir Gustov. And I want to share it because many of these will highlight really sympathetic stories of love and loss and having a lot of things taken from you forcibly. Vladimir Gustov was the hardest one for me to edit because it's extremely difficult to sympathize with him. And I think that that's a really important thing to include because the reality is it doesn't really matter, if we sympathize with him. He's still in the same situation as the rest of these men. And we always rush to judgment, especially with this when we're dealing with a population that has done objectively heinous things. Many of them, we try to pick out the ones that we think are worthy or we don't have to judge them as harshly. But I've always found myself drawn to those who we sort of are unequivocal in our condemnation. I'm always interested in what their experience is, and Vladimir Gustov is one of those individuals. I came from Russia to the United States to perform in circuses in 1991. For 15 years, I brought joy to children, until I didn't. In 2006, I touched someone who was underage. I admitted to my horrible crime. I was convicted, sentenced, and imprisoned. I've been out of prison once for 14 months. All I wanted was to see the circus again. I rode my bicycle down to Shelburne Farms, but I didn't think to tell my parole officer that I was going to the show. I was working at a Burger King, so I was around children every day. But they thought the circus was different. My parole officer arrested me, and I lost my apartment. Since I didn't have a place to go back to, they threw me in jail rather than let me out on bail. My caseworker told me about another inmate who chose to be deported rather than stay here. She suggested I consider it. I declined. I had a job, a place to live, and remorse for my crimes. I was getting my life back together, gone in an instant. Now I am 69 years old, still here for what I did decades ago. I've paid a steep price for my actions, and the state has paid a steep price for my actions as well. To date, $910,000 to keep me behind bars. When will it be enough? I'll close out on that one and really open it up for the remainder of the time to. If you want to hear more from the book, I'm happy to. But otherwise, willing to talk more about the project, about some of the more recent developments with it, but then also just broadly speaking, a discussion on the criminal justice system and any other topics related to that you all will find interesting.
Since we're a small group today, I wish that people would just sort of raise their hand. If there's under react, you can physically raise your hand, but this would require that I would be able to see you first. So are there any questions? John Davidson, unmute yourself.
Yes, hi. I'm John Davidson. I happen to be an attorney who worked mostly on legal reform in other countries. And what strikes me about your presentation is that I like it. I'm sympathetic to you, but you must always remember that every society on this earth has to deal with the process of incarceration. And some societies, in fact, are much more grim about it than we are because they have less money. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would describe myself on the policy side as sort of a realist when it comes to incarceration. And I wouldn't say that the US has one criminal justice system. We often talk about it in terms of that, but we have roughly 3,000 distinct criminal justice systems between county jails, tribal and federal prisons and jails, and then all of the states. And all of those have different prosecutors, different courts, and ultimately different amounts of resources to devote to their facilities. One of the main differences is that in the federal system, you have about 250,000 people incarcerated. Most federal penitentiaries are quite sophisticated and quite well funded. A lot of them have wardens with PhDs, much like they do in Europe. Then you have Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, which I mentioned earlier, which is the largest prison in America with roughly 6,000 inmates, about 40% of whom are serving life without parole. And it's on the old Angola plantation. The men literally work in cotton fields, and the officers ride around on horseback with shotguns, and they force them to, do a prison rodeo 5 times a year, where men play poker in the center of a ring and they send bulls out after them. So, there's a gradient of horror in the criminal justice system. Now, to John's point, every society has them. We turn to Norway and Denmark, to some degree Germany, for their prison systems. But the reality is they tweak certain things about them. They don't have an Angola. But some of our facilities in say Maine or even Massachusetts are not that far off. San Quentin, even in the US, are comparably sophisticated. They're still prisons, and that's really where there was an academic debate a few years ago. A British academic went to Norway and wrote a book after doing some prison tours about how amazing Scandinavia's prison system is, and it was he wrote a book about how exceptional they are. And the Norwegians, these Norwegian academics, wrote back and really harshly criticized him, saying, "Look, we might be better, but we're still a prison. We're still going to have the same challenges. It might not be to the same degree, but there are still suicides, there's still violence, we're still locking people away." So I think what I appreciate about that is that there are, to the first part of the book, there are inherent indignities to incarceration. And the degree to which we accept or exacerbate those indignities will depend on resources, culture, and the goals of imprisonment and the scale of imprisonment. The U.S. is exceptional, not in its punitiveness within prisons, but for the sheer scale of them, rivaled only by China and El Salvador. El Salvador in terms of rate, not in terms of absolute numbers, but they do have the highest incarceration rate in the world by far. But and that also differs. Vermont is only marginally more than say the United Kingdom, versus Louisiana and Georgia are on par with El Salvador. So no two parts of the system are the same. And as when I was reading Vladimir Gustav's piece, I also want to highlight that there's the problem of crime, and often we don't include that within the conversation of prison because we are horrified at the realities of prison. And I've done restorative justice for a long time, and I really believe in it for certain people. There's a great book by Danielle Surratt, Until We Reckon, and it's about restorative justice. And her argument is that a lot of the criminal justice reform conversation is about letting out certain types of people. So the sort of nonviolent drug offender. That accounts for roughly 15% of the prison population. 60% of people in state prisons either committed murder, sexual assault, or another form of serious violent crime like aggravated assault or robbery. So the population is really hard to, again, like break down and say, oh, these are the ones that are here wrongfully. This is really the example that of what we should move away from. And that's what makes this really hard. Her argument is that we need to have a restorative justice movement for violent crime, not just for non-violent crime, if we're actually going to change the system. I'm sympathetic to that. I think that it's a lot harder. When she's done great work with gang members in New York, when I've done work in Vermont, we don't usually work with violent offenders, but when we work with quite serious non-violent offenders, we sort of reach the limitations of restorative justice. We realize, okay, well, there are some people who are just going to refuse to meaningfully engage with this and actually sort of put us in a situation as volunteers where we have to defend each other from abuse by the individual. So it's complicated. And I appreciate, John, you raising that point, because this is a very nuanced conversation. And my hope with the book was not to just say, this is a simple matter. My friend June in Hanover, when she looked at it and said, oh, isn't it a shame these people are in prison? I want people to think about that, but then I also want them to think about the district attorney's response, which is, I put a lot of these people there for a reason. That's the kind of conversation I wanted to foster with this.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And I agree with what you're trying to say here, which is it's not as simple as it looks.
Exactly.
John.
Sorry, I dropped my headphone.
As a teacher, I remember saying many times to a student who said, oh, well, no, I don't have a question. It's a really stupid question. I said, no, please give me that stupid question. And they say, why? I said, well, chances are I can answer it. Of course, there was a little bit of a lie there, that the stupid questions are really not stupid at all. They're really basic. So, for those of you I can't see and those of you I can, please, any kind of commentary or thought that's in your mind, or maybe you don't even frame it as a thought.
Yeah, they don't need to be questions. They can just be reflections or anything like that. We have one in the chat. What drew you to your work in prisons? It's a couple of different things. To start, the sort of better answer. I'll get to sort of what led me directly to it, but the sort of context is that my uncle was a federal correctional officer in Florida for his entire career, and he ended up passing away quite young. He passed away at 62, which is about 3 years beyond the average life expectancy for a correctional officer in America. It's one of the other interesting things about America's prisons, is that they don't just, the pains of imprisonment don't just apply to those who are incarcerated. They also apply to people who have to work in these facilities. And it's a very stressful, very demanding job that is not financially that rewarding, and doesn't hold a lot of prestige in society, for sure. So I was very interested in his work, and he never married. He was a 12-step volunteer, was a minister, like really a devoted guy. And the rest of his family and my family was on the other side of the criminal justice system. His grandparents were moonshiners in Prohibition. My dad and a lot of his cousins were drug runners in 1970s Miami. And he really broke from that pattern of the family and ended up working in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And most of my family exited, the sort of criminal life they had in Miami and ended up moving away and starting businesses and being quite successful, normal people. They left behind crime and never went back to it. And by the time I was born, my parents were quite old parents. By the time I was born in the late 90s, there was no trace of that chaotic lifestyle left. I grew up in Massachusetts, in Western Mass, and I had a very stable upbringing. But I grew up on these stories of like my dad in an airboat in the Everglades. I was like, what the hell is going on in this? By the time I got, to college, I only then started to really realize how unusual that was. That like most people's parents didn't do that when they were, my age. But really, what sort of changed is, so I went to college at Dartmouth, and not only were all of my peers not the children of drug runners, but they were all the children of investment bankers and attorneys and management consultants. And about half of my graduating class went into those two industries, management consulting and investment banking. So when I was a junior or sophomore, I guess it would have been in the summer between my sophomore and junior year, they sort of like force you to like pick a path because they have to keep those numbers high. So that summer, everyone in the sophomore class has to go back to school, and the recruiters descend on it like flies. And everyone is like, "Are you working for Goldman Sachs next summer?" Wait, no, like it's super high pressure. And I started to go along with it, and then realized I don't want to work for McKinsey. I don't want to go into this. This is not what I believe in. This is not where I came from. This is not what I care about. And I went with the most radical thing you can do at an elite liberal arts college. I decided I wanted to go to seminary. And so I was learning ancient Greek at the time, and it's been a lot of time reading the Bible in ancient Greek. And was like, what are ways I have this strong interest. What are the ways I can actually use an interest in faith and explore something intellectually, but then also have a vocation? And I landed at chaplaincy. I then was sort of between a couple of different areas of chaplaincy. Prisons appealed to me the most because it was people in crisis. It was sort of the raw, not that the hospital chaplaincy is not, but it's people grappling with really serious guilt and shame. It's a very extreme environment, and that appealed to me because I wanted something that was still going to be very challenging, demand a lot of me, and that sort of then clicked into place with, oh, I actually have sort of a weird connection to this, and I have an uncle who could be a mentor, and all of those sorts of things. So I started to go down that path, and around that same time, I mentioned earlier that there was the two men who had murdered two Dartmouth professors about 20 years ago. They did it as teenagers. They were 16 and 17, and they were just living in Chelsea, Vermont, and had ended up attempting to kill a couple of other people as well, but ended up murdering these two professors. And oddly enough, this is a random trivia fact, but the new governor-elect of New Hampshire, Kelly Ayotte, was the assistant attorney general who prosecuted them in 2002, I think. But this was a really significant crime for the Dartmouth community, and I remember when I moved onto the Vermont side, I had befriended a couple of people who had lived, in Vermont for 40 years or more. And they remembered the crime very vividly. It was something that totally disrupted the sort of quaint peace villages in that region. So I became really interested in interviewing them. It was going to be the 20th anniversary of their crimes, and I didn't want to talk to them about the crimes. I wanted to talk to them about their experience in prison. What was that like for them as having spent almost their entire lives in prison and going there as children? One of the men, Robert, was, I believe, the last minor to be sentenced to life without parole. It was a Supreme Court decision about it that allowed it to happen. He was convicted at 17, I think. So I tried to get access to them, and the New Hampshire Department of Corrections wouldn't let me. And that was sort of perhaps a radicalizing moment for me, where I was coming up against a policy that I thought was really dumb, and it sort of started to get me interested in the policy aspects of prison work. And from there, I ended up meeting the founder of the Cicero Institute, and when he told me, hey, I want to have this organization work on criminal justice reform, but I don't want someone who's going to approach it from a sort of a traditional lens. I don't want an attorney or anything like that. And he offered me a job and said, look, you can transform a lot of individual lives as a chaplain, but if you come work on policy and work on systemic reform, you can help tens to hundreds of thousands of people, which as a 21-year-old I thought was really compelling. So I joined him to do that, and it was a few years after that I then returned to prison ministry with Hanover Friends. So I still am very involved, and I am currently in a correctional chaplaincy course in addition to my penology program at Cambridge at Wheaton College, which has been sort of an interesting experience because most prison ministry is done by very evangelical Christians, and Wheaton College, it has like the Billy Graham Center, which is where this program is housed. So I'm the only Quaker by a landslide, but it's been extremely formative for me to learn how to approach this work rigorously. And frankly, they're the ones that do it more than anyone, so they know a lot about it. And there are plenty of theological disagreements, but when it comes down to the content of the course, it's been extremely helpful in doing this work well. Since I moved to Utah, I've been less directly involved in chaplaincy, only because I'm considering doing some academic research on it. So I don't want to be participating in it and studying it at the same time. So instead, I've been working with the chaplain on basically building religious accommodation profiles for some of the more obscure religions. They have a pretty big facility. It's about 4,000 people. And because of the LDS church's reach, a lot of people move to Utah from the Pacific Islands, and as Mormon converts move here, lose the Mormon faith and go back to their traditional faiths, and then they have to be and if they're in prison, they have to be accommodated by the Utah Department of Corrections, which is really only equipped to accommodate Mormons. So I've been helping them figure out, like, what are the diets, what are the holidays, what are the different things you have to do and you're legally obligated to do for some of these faiths that they're less familiar with.
And Devon, I'm going to ask one of the stupid questions, to quote Eric. I don't know nothing about all of this subject, so it's easy for me to ask this question. How much of what you see in the prisons would go away if we stopped imprisoning people who are basically there just because they're mentally ill?
It's a great question. So a lot of my other work, in addition to prisons, is homelessness, and there's a big intersection. So I spent about 4 years working strictly on prisons and probation and parole, and a little bit on policing. And I had a colleague who was focused on housing policy, and eventually, our organization was founded in San Francisco. So he eventually started to move into working on the homelessness space from a policy angle. And those were distinct circles, but we kept looking at each other's research and saying, you are dealing with a lot of the same people. Like there's a portion of the population you're working with that is one-to-one the population I'm working with. It's not everybody, but there's a lot of overlap. And I started to collaborate with him, and then eventually he ended up leaving, and I took over his portfolio. So there's, homelessness is a very, very diverse issue. A lot of times it gets sort of reduced to sort of simple, what I see is more political taglines than actual policy proposals, but it's a complicated issue. About a third of the unsheltered homeless population, people who are living on the street, have been to prison, and have been to prison fairly recently. So there is a pipeline of people who leave prison and can't get their footing and end up on the street. Primarily, that's sex offenders. That's a huge portion of it. So there is definitely a connection there. The mental health side is interesting because prisons are not great places to treat mental health. However, they have half of the country's psychiatric beds. So they are mental hospitals. We don't have, every state has maybe one that's entirely state funded because the feds have said they don't want to fund mental hospitals. That was a Reagan era change to deinstitutionalize the asylums. The result has been that states can really, only afford their one state hospital, and then the rest is them paying for mental health care in prisons, which is notably worse. I will say Maine is an exception to that. Maine State Prison at Warren has a dedicated severe mental health wing that I've been to, and it's excellent. They provide a really high level of care and are dedicated to providing that service in an environment that is distinct from the rest of the prison. Most places don't do that. And also those are the most extreme mental health cases. You have probably 60% of the prison population is struggling with some form of mental illness. That could be ranging from something diagnosable like schizophrenia to something that is more, as a result of severe trauma or brain injury. Then you add in comorbidity substance abuse, which is also a comparable size of the population in prison. And repeated use can lead to heightened symptoms. It gets complicated. I think some parts of America have experimented with trying to create mental health diversion programs. A lot of those are quite good if they're very hands-on. When they're not, they end up usually failing. But I wouldn't say that if we were, there's a famous graph that shows like the deinstitutionalization population and the increase in mass incarceration. And it's a really neat, one of those, academics love those kind of neat graphs. But it's more complicated than that. The populations have shifted. It's not all the same. And there's other trends influencing it. But certainly we have created prisons to be the default mental health institutions in absence of other similar kinds of institutions. But I will say that the writings of Irving Goffman and some of the others who led the charge on deinstitutionalization of the mental health community, they wrote about mental health institutions in the same way they wrote about prisons. His book Asylum uses them interchangeably almost as having similar pains of imprisonment and a lot of these similar issues. So again, there's a sort of a reason they got shut down. That was 40, 50 years ago. I think that we've advanced to some degree. And clearly we see that prisons are not a better alternative to them. So I'm hopeful that we'll be more open to trying to invest in that sort of thing. One of the big changes that's been on top of people's minds recently is most states have tens to hundreds of millions of dollars in opioid settlement funds from lawsuits against the Sackler family and other pharmaceutical companies. And there is some belief that those funds, because of the comorbidities of opioid use and mental health, could be used to make substantial investments into alternatives to incarceration for both of those populations. We just haven't seen it yet.
So,
Oh, John?
any other questions or comments?
I just wanted to ask you if you have a comment on the fact that last Tuesday, the majority of Americans voted for a convicted felon. And I saw posters in my town of his mugshot. Underneath it said, "I voted for the felon." These are 10-foot by 10-foot posters. What is your
Yeah.
comment?
No, that's a really interesting point. And it's one that I saw a lot of social media posts from a lot of outside of the country, sort of mystified by Americans voting for a convicted felon. I think that the optimistic side. Then President Trump did sign the First Step Act. In my circles, everyone loves the First Step Act. I'm very skeptical of it. Like it is pretty small tweaks. Like it didn't really impact that many people. But to those people, it mattered a lot. The federal criminal justice system is quite small. There's about 250,000 people in prison. This affected maybe 5,000 of those individuals directly, and then for the remainder, it created some pathways to get out somewhat sooner. So he's been the only president since, before Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton signed one of the largest expansions of the criminal justice system. So I don't really remember a time when someone has taken on that issue. And there were a handful of people around him who were pretty key in getting him to do it. That's a good thing. And maybe we'll see more of it coming from him. And his rhetoric around it has been certainly to that end. I mean, there's sort of an interesting duality of he's really wants to be tough on crime, but is also talking about sort of second chances and that kind of thing. That's my optimistic take. My pessimistic take is that a lot of the people who are committed to criminal justice reform had no problem stigmatizing him for being a felon. And that's perhaps like a really highfalutin take, but I do find it challenging when people who in everyday life believe in trying to reform the criminal justice system and destigmatize some of these things, then are like, throw the book at the sky. There's some cognitive dissonance there that is challenging. I have no love for the man, but from a sort of where he fits into the movement, it's tricky. Now, a lot of that is also that a lot of the movement around criminal justice reform is a belief, not so much that the criminal justice system is unusable, but that it is directed in the wrong direction, that it's directed at poor people and not at the rich and powerful. So I think a lot of it comes from that, of that he is the epitome of rich and powerful. One of the richest men and one of the most powerful men. So there is this desire to sort of use the criminal justice system to go after the real criminals, the real people who are destroying society. And they just see that a lot of people who are currently ensnared in it are maybe interpersonally criminals, but are not actually like the ones destroying society. So I'm sympathetic to that. I understand that position, but I think that as far as a discussion, it's complicating a lot because the sides aren't as neat. And the cognitive dissonance sort of extends to both sides, because again, you have for his supporters, you have people who are saying lock up everyone that commits a crime forever, especially if they're immigrants, but then are saying, oh, well, so what, he's a felon, that it doesn't matter. So everyone's sort of like grappling with this challenge, and I don't have an answer, but that's sort of my stray thoughts. I don't really know how to feel about it. I don't necessarily think that it's a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's a messy thing.
Well, thank you for that, because I find it disturbing in that since I lived half my life abroad, I look at this the way foreigners would look at it, which is that it's crazy to have the felon in chief be delighted with poor people and immigrants being thrown out of the country or thrown into jail, while at the same time his own crimes are ignored and denied by his half of the population.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
So with that, if there are no more questions or commentary, I would like Devon to have a chance to make a final statement for his presentation.
Any other final comments before I start? Well, thank you all. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak about this, and I think we've covered a lot of ground. And I hope that you'll consider the book. I think that it gives a really a human perspective on a lot of this, and again, the writing is quite good. My writing is the worst part of the book. You can slog through my commentaries, but the rest of it is really digestible and quite beautiful. And I'll say that for a lot of the men, knowing that people on the outside care enough to pick up a book and read what they say is life-changing. I mean, it is, being in prison it takes your power. It takes, everything that we understand to be kind of core to the human existence, your agency, and it strips it away. And the biggest fear and source of anger, and in Rein's note at the beginning of the book, that I might read, just because I think that that's maybe the best way to end it is to end it with what actually he said. This book is a collaborative creation of the inmates of the Vermont Department of Corrections, born of the frustration and despair that accompanies our captivity. The stories and artwork herein are, for most of us, our only voice, whispers that collectively amplify into a shout for justice. No two of us followed the same pathway to prison, but from the unfortunate position at which our paths have crossed, we have endeavored to create beauty in the face of the horrors of our reality. My name is Rein Colts. I am an artist imprisoned at the Southern State Correctional Facility in Springfield, Vermont. I began sketching my fellow inmates mostly as a way to pass my time productively and bring a modicum of joy to the other men and their families. Drawing a person fosters a certain intimacy and friendship with them, and I found that through my art, I earned the vulnerability of the men that I drew. Some inmates spoke of their children or a distant lover. Others raged against the courts or the prison administration. Many expressed exasperation. Some found faith, but all hungered for purpose. We started to write down our stories to accompany my sketches. What started as a pastime transformed into collective expression that had the potential to overcome the loss of our voices at the hands of the criminal justice system. No one listens to us, to one of us, but maybe they would hear us if we spoke together. Maybe they could see us if we were transformed into art and beauty. Chains, cell blocks, and chemical sprays have a way of signifying to the people subjected to them that they do not matter, that they are meant to be dominated and incapacitated. To the public, seeing your government subject people to domination signifies that those people probably needed to be dominated to keep you safe. And we, the subjects of domination, lose our time, our voices, our dignity, our humanity, and too often our lives. In just the last year, 2% of the inmates at Southern State Correctional Facility have died. We know how little we matter to the state, but through our art and our stories, I hope we can convince you that we should matter to you. Rein Colts. I will close with that. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Devon. This will be edited and posted on our YouTube site. And thank you for coming. Stay well.
Thank you, Devon.
Thank you.